The session, as you know, is called By Boat, By Plane. Just a little housekeeping to begin with. Would you please now turn all your phones to silent? And if you're tweeting, the hashtag is #ADLWW. And a reminder that there will be a book signing at the end of the session. So without further ado, I'd like to welcome our two authors today. The first is Munjed Al Muderis, whose book is Walking Free. And he came to Australia in, what year did you come, 99?
Depends on what you call it, come to Australia.
Okay.
I arrived on Australian soil on the 8th of November 1999, and I was first recognised in Australia on the 26th of August 2000.
Indeed. And you came from Iraq through Malaysia and Indonesia.
Yep.
With no small assistance from people smugglers.
I would say a fair bit of assistance.
Yes. So there's a big. The book is about this story, and joining him on the stage we have Cat Thao Nguyen, whose book is called We Are Here. And Cat Thao came with her family in 1980. Her family came from Vietnam through Cambodia and Thailand, where she was born in a refugee camp and then settled in Sydney. And I'm personally delighted because I'm the kind of older generation of the refugee story. My father came in 1960 from the former Yugoslavia through a UN refugee camp in Italy and then Bonagilla. So you have the full complement today, and I think we should have a television show. I will start with inviting each of the authors to just give a little brief nutshell synopsis of the story they tell in their book and a little statement about why they decided to tell it. So I'll start with Munjed.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, everybody, for having us here. It's really great honour to be presenting in front of you. I'm supposed to talk for 3 minutes. That's 30 seconds gone. My book is about my story. I'm an orthopedic surgeon. I had the pleasure of living in Adelaide for 6 months at the Women's and Children's Hospital, where I served you guys. But now I'm based in Sydney. I do hip and knee replacement surgery, but in 1984 I watched The Terminator, and it fascinated me, the idea of making half man, half machine. And living in Iraq, I've seen a lot of people who are disabled, so I decided that I would investigate this and see if we can do something. And it then reached a peak where I was honoured to be presented in front of Her Majesty the Queen, where she honoured one of the soldiers that lost both limbs, ironically, in the Middle East due to IUD. And I managed to get robotic legs attached to him. And I was invited to watch him, and it was very, very impressive moment. But this is not where I started. I started my journey as a junior doctor in Iraq, where I was attending my theatre normally, and all of a sudden 3 busloads of army deserters stopped in front of Baghdad University Hospital, and we were ordered to abandon the elective lists and start mutilating these people by cutting their ears off. So I had to flee Iraq all of a sudden, and the journey ended me up being here in Australia in Curtin Detention Centre, which was a hell of a place. I spent 10 months in the detention centre, and I was naughty. I caused a lot of trouble by keeping my mouth not shut. And I spent a fair bit of time in different prisons. West Australia prisons are beautiful. They're really good. And every time they get me out of the detention centre to the prison, I say, woohoo, back to freedom, because the jail system is brilliant here in Australia. So eventually I was released, and here I am in front of you. Thank you.
I will just add that he didn't cut the tops of the ears off.
I was a coward. I ran away.
That's why he came. Cat Thao.
First of all, it's a great pleasure for me to be here. I actually, for a couple of years, I was the South Australian trade representative to Vietnam. So to come back here to Adelaide and to be here in front of you is just fantastic. I also want to say hello to Minister for the Arts, Jack Snelling, and also Tung up the front here, a Member of Parliament. Look, you know, my parents came from Vietnam. My dad was a former banker, and my mother was a law student, but they were on the wrong side of the war. My father was conscripted into the Southern Republican Army, and when the war ended in 1975, he was put into a re-education camp. And it was through other people and not him that I found out that in the re-education camp, he was made to say every day that he was a traitor to his country. The only protein they could get were insects and rats that they could kill. There was hard labor. When he left the camp, he married my mother, and at that time, her family, all of the brothers were put in re-education centres as well, and they were there for about 10 years. When my father was then made to demine landmines, and throughout the Vietnam War and also the Cambodian genocide, the killing fields under Pol Pot and the Khmer Rouge, these areas were one of the most heavily mined areas in the world. So at that point, he knew that he had to leave because it was a death sentence. And in the middle of the night in 1979, a young family fled. And interestingly, you probably would all know that a lot of Vietnamese refugees came by boat and left by boat. But in actual fact, my family left by foot across the border into Cambodia, through the killing fields and into Thailand, the 6th refugee camp where I was born. And when I was researching for this book, I realized that for those that had left by boat, between 1 in 3 and 1 in 5 survived. So a 30% to 50% chance. And for those that had went by foot, the same route that my parents took, 90% perished. So we were the 10% that actually survived. And only single young men left at the time. But when my family left, my mother is a 23-year-old, pregnant with me, a 12-month-old baby, my father and 2 15-year-old boys decided to cross through the jungles where my young mother walked through severed heads, limbs, and actually saw a stake, a wooden stake with the head of a severed man mounted on the stake and written in blood in Khmer. Later on, they found out that the word meant Vietnamese. So they looked at this, they went through, and finally, through a lot of trauma, they got processed. And I wrote the book because I wanted to honour my family, the legacy and the miracle that we had survived, came to this country and tried to build a life through the kindness, actually, in those times, very different to Munjed and when we arrived. We arrived at Villawood Immigration Hostel, and it wasn't an immigration detention centre. And we were delivered to the miracle of life in this country through the kindness of Australians. And I wanted to write this book, not only to honour my parents, but to remind ourselves that we can become kind again.
Cat Thao, you just pointed to really the front of mind question for me after reading both of the books. And in one of my former professional incarnations, I was a parliamentary advisor, and I had, well, privilege is an interesting word, had the interesting experience of going into Woomera Detention Centre in 2001, where I was very visibly presented with evidence of the fact that Australia has changed in its attitudes towards people seeking refuge in this country. So I'd like both of you to really talk about the contemporary debate surrounding asylum seekers in Australia, which I do consider to be substantially degraded relative to every other time in my lifetime. How do you feel about that? And why did you write the book? Because you could have just hung out as an orthopaedic surgeon and kept doing your brilliant work and remained silent about what happened to you in Curtin and the kind of abuses of power that Australian officials meted out to you in a context where they lacked accountability. So why did you name up that truth?
Um, first and foremost, I feel sorry for whichever government rules Australia because it's, or runs Australia, because it is a very difficult situation, a very difficult subject. I want to give you an example, and from that you will understand why I wrote the book. At one stage in Curtin Detention Centre, there were 1,252 people at one time inside that compound. Out of this number, there were 13 medical doctors coming from Iraq. And so that's high percentage per capita, 12 of which are currently, as we speak, fully qualified specialists in different fields, running successful practices. And it happened that I was best man in one of the doctors' weddings, and after a few drinks I stood up to give my speech, and I started the talk by giving an example and an experience that we shared inside the Curtin Detention Centre, and it was a shock to the guy who was his best man, because he was totally ashamed, and he pulled me down. He said, "Shut up! Don't tell anyone that I was a refugee, and no one knows. Everybody thinks that I'm a migrant." And I looked at him and I said, "Why? Is it that shameful to be a refugee?" So that was one of the main things that made me write this book. He's very successful, but he's very ashamed of his past. And I don't think anyone should be ashamed of fleeing their country if they refuse to commit crimes.
Look, I think that it's really sad that in the current public discourse that we are demonizing these people, as Munjed has just shared. I think it's really sad for Australia that our public debate around this space is so one-dimensional and it lacks courage. And I really feel that we are being so short-sighted in how we are looking at this particular issue. You know, multiculturalism is difficult. And now, having lived abroad, I've been living in Ho Chi Minh City for the last 8 years, actually. It's interesting that I've returned to the place that my parents have fled. But I've been living in Ho Chi Minh City for the last 8 years. I'm working as a corporate lawyer. I do mergers and acquisitions on multi-million-dollar, billion-dollar deals. And what's really interesting is those people, including Australians and young Australians, but not only Australians, those people, Vietnamese, Americans, whoever that I deal with, who come from monocultural societies, homogenous societies, those people don't do very well in the boardroom. They also, they also find it very difficult to negotiate difference. Now, if we look at Australia and where we are positioned for the future, we live in a globally integrated world, economically, financially, in so many different perspectives. Now, we can capitalize and embrace the migrants, the asylum seekers, the people who can make our nation diverse, because that is capital. Now, what I see outside of Australia is that there are people who, I'll give you an example. A really good friend of mine, very successful, also grew up in Sydney. He started up a couple of companies, sold it for a massive amount of money, launched a fund, and in Vietnam. Now he says, I refuse to go to Australia to raise capital because it's just too difficult. The way that Australians see Asia, the way that Australians see things that are different is so different to the US. I go there, I raise capital, they just get it. Now that is our lost economic opportunity, okay? And so when I reflect back now about our economic prosperity or the lack of the potential that we can actually achieve and the asylum seeker policy, these are direct connections. And I feel that if we don't actually shift our perspectives, we are going to not be the prosperous nation that we are.
So just bouncing off that comment, it seems to me that what you're both in slightly different ways pointing to is a lack of sophistication in dialogue about Australian identity, really. I mean, both of you have a kind of hybrid identity simply because you've come as refugees. I mean, I have a hybrid identity as well. There does seem to be a dissonance between that understanding of a complexity surrounding diversity and the value it can bring, and a lot of the messaging that's coming from a whole range of institutions of power in Australia, whether that's the Parliament, the media, or whatever. Would you like to talk about this idea of being Australian in a way?
What make any human being strong is education, and unfortunately we listen to the news a lot. And unfortunately, the hot potato now is stop the boats, and the message that is being given over and over and over again, especially if it's a bipartisan from both sides of the parties agreeing on one subject. I mean, Labour and Liberals never agreed on anything except the boat people, which is funny. The problem is what common Australians do not know is that these boat people are a slice of the community. There is the good, there is the bad, and there is the ugly. And unfortunately, what we are doing now, at the moment, I'm not a politician, I don't want to play politics, but we are dealing with a major global problem. Every time I travel overseas, and I travel to Europe 5-6 times a year for conferences and give talks, and a lot of people I talk to, they don't know that I'm a boat person, and it is shameful that when I speak in Germany, for example, they ask me, where are you from, and I say I'm from Australia, and they say, oh gosh, you come from this place where they treat people very badly. It is really sad that we have this bad impression about us in the world, because Europe is dealing with massive number of asylum seekers. We are dealing with the largest number of asylum seekers and refugees since the Second World War. So we need to be more educated about it. We need to be dealing with this in a more cost-effective, more efficient, and most importantly, more humane manner, and make the good out of these people better, the bad good, and the ugly pretty. I don't know if you can do that though.
I think it's really terrible that, you know, some of the things that are happening in these detention facilities are the things that my parents have shared with me that happened in makeshift camps 35 years ago in the border of Cambodia and Thailand. You know, when it was the most atrocious time, when people were severing the heads of other human beings. And yet some of the things that my parents are telling me that happened in those camps are happening right now. That is just deeply, deeply hurtful. And following from Munjed's, points, I think that why do we need to be more humane, right? We are living in a time now when there's so much conflict in the world. Why do we need to be more humane? And going back to my earlier point, how does being humane actually make us successful as a nation? Now, when we were crossing through the killing fields in Cambodia, my brother, who was 12 months old at the time, he got dysentery and he was bitten by a scorpion. He was a little baby and he was going to die. This old man gave my older brother a small dried mandarin, and it was the only juice that he could suck on. And my mother says to me, decades later, it could have been that one mandarin from this stranger that was the difference between life and death for my son. As we traveled through, we were also smuggled through by various people smugglers. This one particular man who was transporting my mother on a bicycle through the jungles, while the others were abandoned by the people smugglers, this man did not abandon her. And he gave her a black magic pocket. He put it around her and he indicated, this will protect you. I want you to live. and he gave her a sarong. And that sarong actually belonged to his wife, who was murdered by the Khmer Rouge. Now, my mother wrapped my older brother, who was a baby, 12 months old, in this sarong tightly, pretending that they were traders and this baby was actually goods. He delivered her through the border to the first Red Cross camp instead of actually giving her over to the paramilitary people. And if she was given over, she would have been raped. He took her to the camps and he made sure that she was reunited with her husband. Growing up, this sarong was wrapped around me as my mother cut my hair very badly. It's on the cover of the book, actually. And actually, I have this sarong to this day. And I hold that sarong as an indication of the kindness of strangers who delivered us to the miracle of life. Now, when I reflect on where we are today, what will make young Australians positioned for the future successful is not just to be literate in another language. It's not enough in this global world. It's actually to be able to be empathetic to someone who is fundamentally different from you, culturally, linguistically, religiously. If you are able to be empathetic in this globalized world, in any commercial space, in health professions, anything, then you will be able to navigate how the world is so complex. And what makes us empathetic? Our sense of humanity. If we don't hold on to this, we will not succeed.
So, Cat Thao, how do we do that? How do we, by any measure, Australia is an unusually prosperous, safe and stable country compared to just about everywhere else in the world. How do we inculcate more of an attitude where we share our mandarins? That's a beautiful part of the book, the story of the mandarin and your brother. What are your views about that?
I think that it's, first of all, we have to acknowledge that there is no band-aid solution, that Australia as part of this world it's complex, that it's not simple, that asylum seeker policy, the way that we integrate and support people of minority, of difference in a broader multicultural Australia is difficult. We need to know that. And if we accept that, then we have to be brave. We have to be courageous. We have to come together to, first of all, acknowledge that a diverse Australia is a powerful Australia. That's step one, difficult, okay? Step two, once we acknowledge that, is to be brave enough in order to have discussions that are multidimensional and not one-dimensional. And that is also difficult. But I think it takes us story by story, human contact by human contact. If your neighbor, is someone who is different from you and you have those conversations, when you know someone's personal story, you can't hurt them because they are human too. And I think that's why Munjed and myself wrote these books, so that in some small way, we can help to share those stories and not demonize people. And that's, I think, some of the things that we can do to be a better Australia.
Small details often jump out from books, and for me, as I said, the story of the mandarin in yours is very powerful. Munjed, in yours, it's the story of the unnecessary cruelty of the Australian immigration official who was running Curtin Detention Centre, who seems to have gone out of his way to make the application of the process such as it was, and the punishments that were available to him to mete out to you, unusually targeted at you. How do you, and I urge everyone to read that part of the book, but what's your response to him today? What would you say to him if he were sitting right in the front row?
Back then and now, I feel the same. I felt very sorry for him because obviously he was a bureaucrat who was trying to do his job properly, and he took it out of context, and he was very passionate about it to a degree where he has his world inside the Curtin Detention Centre. And that's a human nature, unfortunately. If we don't contain this urge inside us to control, and that's what makes humans different from each other, is that the more sophisticated, the more educated, the more civilized person is the person who will curb this animalistic nature of domination and trying to substitute people that under his authority. I mean, the stuff that happened inside Curtin Detention Center while I was there was hilarious. First, we were taking out of the bus, and the first thing, I lost my name, and I was given 982. That's your name for the coming time until you decide to go back. And that was very weird, because I don't think any human being is supposed to be called by a number. I mean, I was born with a name, I was given a name, and I'm entitled to be called by this name. And that's why I love the jail, because at least they called me by my name. And then things that happens over and over and over again is just showing that this guy was so passionate about control and power, and it completely contradicts the principles and the fundamentalist elements of our society, which is justice. And all what I can say, what happened in Curtin Detention Center was unjust.
Well, justice is a nice word, because we've got on this panel, we've got 2 lawyers and 1 doctor. So you two are, by anyone's measure, again, really outstanding success stories in the Australian context, the global context. You're both leading professionals. You've both overachieved relative to most people's standards of satisfaction in terms of their careers, and goodness knows what both of you are going to do in the time remaining to you. What about the question about the stories of asylum seekers or refugees and immigrants who come who are not the golden boys and girls? I mean, you're almost the pin-up boys of the refugee success,
Yeah.
Boys and girls of the pin-up refugee. You know what I'm trying to say. Sorry. What about the others? What about people who have not done as well as you and have not managed to move on from the trauma in the background relating to their departure, including in their own families?
Can I answer that?
Yeah, go on.
Part? Because this is the commonest question that I get asked all the time, is that, well, you're the exception, what about the common? All of these people are coming, they're coming with these fundamentalist ideas, they want to bring their terrorism with them, they want to bring their religion with them, and we need to feed them. Well, it's our duty as a society. These people are a slice of the community, like any household or neighborhood in Sydney or in Adelaide. There is the good, there is the bad, and there is the ugly. Unfortunately, we can't do anything about the ugly, but the good we can help to become better and make use of to build this country more and more to prosperity. The bad we can convert by education. Unfortunately, we are dealing with this crisis. This crisis, if our politicians think that they stop the boats and that they will stop asylum seekers, they need to think again, because it will never end. As long as there are conflicts in the world, people will flee their countries and they will go anywhere they can get to seek safe places. What we are doing now, by incarcerating these people for lengthy times, treating them like numbers in a very harsh environment, we are bringing the bad out of them. We're not helping them. I had to bribe and beg officers in the detention center to give me a marking pen and a whiteboard to teach these people how to read and write, and to teach these people how to communicate in English. I mean, this is ridiculous. How much does it cost to give education inside a detention center? We were so ineffective in the detention center. As I can remember, the government was spending $160 per head from your money, from taxpayers' money, on each person to be fed and held up in this detention center, and the money was paid to the Australian Correctional Management or American Correctional Management, whichever company it's called, and that money was siphoned outside Australia, obviously. Instead of that, we could have utilized these people, tag them, electronically tag them. I mean, that's what they do in Europe. Spend the money on our overstretched police. We have very overstretched police services. Move the money from the Department of Immigration to the police, release these people into peripheral communities. They can collect fruits, they can integrate with the society, and they can report to the police stations. I mean, Europe is a continent of 1 billion people, and they don't lose their asylum seekers. They are very well controlled, and these people go and report to police stations. And there is no detention in Europe. We are unfortunately influencing countries such as the UK and few other countries to take our bad habits by bringing back detention centers from eras that gone since the Second World War, and it is not right. Education is the most important thing, and what's happening now, these people are incarcerated, and I must admit, not everybody inside the detention center is as strong as I am. I spend my time in solitary confinement for 40 days, and I read a book. I spent time in jail. I started teaching people how to play chess. You can utilize the time that you have if you are strong, but if you're weak, you start procrastinate and then feel resentment against everything, and then when you get released into the society, you get taken by evil people who will teach you bad things about the society and how to take revenge against Australia. And that's the wrong thing, because ultimately, if these people are declared to be legitimate asylum seekers, they will be released to the community, and they will be a bad influence on the community instead of being a positive impact and help to build the society. I mean, it is so stupid.
So, Cat Thao,
Yeah, and on that point, I think a lot of people, I don't know if a lot of people know, but an overwhelming majority of asylum seekers, to coming to Australia are actually processed as legitimate refugees. Overwhelming majority. And so the way that we treat these people before they become Australian members of this society is actually quite dangerous. Now, I think on your point, Natasha, you were saying that yes, we are the page 3 pin-up.
Page 1.
Page 1.
You're covered.
It's my natural guilt.
Way.
I put myself, down. It's an Asian thing. So yes, look at us. A doctor, a lawyer. We are the successful refugees, and modern application of multicultural policy is a hypocrisy. There is a policy about the criminal deportation of permanent residents. Now, when I was a law student, when I realised this was going on, I just couldn't believe it. I actually had people who were Vietnamese origin, and they had grown up in Australian society. They arrived to Australia as minors. They were 6 years old, but for some reason, because they were unaccompanied, no one told them they had to get citizenship. And then, of course, they fall by the wayside, and then they get into crime, and then they got picked up from the jail and put into an immigration detention facility. Having spent 30 years in Australia, they don't even speak the language anymore. And yet they were deported back to Vietnam, where they had no roadmap to survive, no community linkages, nothing. And yet we can laud multiculturalism right now is to actually celebrate celebrity chefs, lawyers, doctors, and yet for people who have spent their entire lives and formative years in Australia to not have citizenship, well then, goodbye. That's irresponsible. That's irresponsible for anybody who spends their formative years in Australia. We are responsible for them, right? They are a part of the community, a slice of the community, as Munjed has said. And I recall, I think you will all know Van Nguyen, the young man who was executed in Singapore for trafficking drugs. And not to mention the two that are actually going to be shortly executed, part of the Bali Nine. Now, Van Nguyen was literally born 2 days after me in a Thai refugee camp. He was born on the 17th of August, 1980 in a Thai refugee camp. Why is he dead, and why am I sitting here in front of you? Multiculturalism, our cultural diversity, all this is very, very difficult. But if we not only recognize, but we celebrate difference, we celebrate diversity, then we can actually engender and nurture a sense of belonging for people who don't look like the majority. For me, I'm lucky. I'm educated, I have 2 degrees, and I grew up in this amazing country being very articulate. But despite that, when I grew up in the 80s, I wanted to have blonde hair and blue eyes. And I never saw myself on TV. I never saw myself represented in the hallways of decision making, of power. And so even though I was already translating for my parents and, witnessing the indignity of mute migrants in this country, a former banker reading Les Miserables on the factory floor and actually being abused and bullied at work, I witnessed all of that. And going to school, so at home I was a parent, and then going to school, I was not validated. And despite being able to be articulate, I still felt that I didn't belong. I still felt that this wasn't my home. And for all the people in Bankstown that I grew up in, what about those people who couldn't be articulate, who weren't educated, who didn't see themselves validated? Those were the ones that said, hey, you know what? I've got nothing to lose in this country. I'm not a part of this society. So why even bother? And that is dangerous. That can be criminalized. That can become fundamentalism. And so I think for us, we have a unique opportunity in Australia right now to be brave enough to change the underlying values that is propelling this fearful asylum seeker policy. We need to be able to acknowledge and celebrate difference because we are an island nation. We have never been forced to negotiate difference with anybody. We don't border anybody, right? And so what asset do we have in order to empower ourselves to be kinder, to be more humane, so that we actually don't propel people to hate us, even though they're homegrown? And it starts with our individuals around us. It starts with ourselves to shift the thinking and to share the story that it is difficult. Australia to become a successful, multicultural, amazing nation for the 21st century is difficult, and that we are ready to embrace that difficulty, because if we do, we will be unstoppable.
Do you any longer, do you ever have moments where you wish you had blonde hair and blue eyes now? Or have you moved past that?
I hope that 35 years later I've moved past that, Natasha. Look, growing up as a second generation, I guess, it was very difficult. And one of the reasons actually why I moved back to Vietnam in 2007 was because earlier when I visited Vietnam, I had visited my grandfather's house, the house that my father grew up in. I touched the coconut trees that towered above me, still with shrapnel from the war that my grandfather had planted. And I pulled at the rice that my mother had planted and worked on. And that tangible heritage that I could physically connect with was so powerful to me. I was able to talk to grandparents that I never had growing up. I never had the cousins, extended family that so many Australians have the privilege of experiencing. And so when I was able to connect with that physical, tangible heritage, I then felt that this is where I began. This is sort of the origins of history and ancestral connection. And I didn't want to let go of that. And so in 2007, when I moved back, I really to live and not just actually be a tourist. I experienced what it was to be a part of a visible majority. Everybody looked like me. And I thought that I would be empowered by being anonymous, because in Australia I was visibly different. But actually now moving there and living there, 8 years later, my relationship with Vietnam and actually my relationship with Australia has started to evolve very differently. Wherever you are, I have now concluded, what makes you a minority is heightened. So when I'm in Vietnam, even though I look like everybody else, what is heightened is my Australianness. I grew up in a liberal democracy. There's certain conceptions of gender that is very different to Vietnam. And yet when I'm here, what makes me different is my Vietnameseness and my love of fish sauce. But I also love Australian Shiraz, especially Barossa Shiraz. Sean Smith is amazing, by the way. And so now for me, my conception of home, my conception of what it means to belong somewhere is not necessarily geographically bound by a space. It's where you can feel that you can be uncensored, where you do not have to apologize for being who you are. And that's where love is. And so, home is where my husband is. Home is where my parents are. And I think the more that we can actually replicate that throughout our communities, and the more that we can actually feel connected to all those concentric circles that make us whole as beings, to our family, to our community, to our broader society, then that is where we can actually allow people to be themselves and not to apologize for being a refugee.
Munjed, you didn't grow up in Australia. You were a fully formed adult and a trained medical doctor when you came here, and you can't go back to Iraq realistically.
What are you talking about? I'm dinky die Aussie.
so that's what I'm saying.
What are you talking about?
It's a different kind of entry to an Australian identity. Do you feel Australian now? And if so, what does that look and feel like? Do you ever want to have blonde hair and blue eyes? Because I imagine, there are a lot of all the orthopaedic surgeons I know have blonde hair and blue eyes and Anglo-Saxon names, and you don't. So,
am I going to tell you the story that I was told?
Yeah.
Look. I strongly believe, as we mentioned before, what make a place is the people. I am Australian. This is home, and this is the country that I will defend to the last drop of my blood. I feel 100% loyalty to this country, and I take that from my father, who always said to me that it's not the place, it's not the geography, it's not the brick or the wall. It's wherever you are sheltered, wherever you are fed, wherever you are provided with water, that's the place that is home to you. And to be honest, not being disloyal to Iraq, but Australia gave me all what I wanted. Iraq didn't give me anything. I ran away from Iraq because of the hostilities there. And unfortunately nowadays, Iraq has changed from a secular dictatorship to a religious anarchy, and I don't feel anything left in Iraq. Unfortunately, the people that I knew, the people that I grew up with, they all around the world, refugees obviously, and I don't see anything to go back to. Now, talking about acceptance and whether I would like to be blonde and blue eyes, I don't see that a problem, to be honest. I do speak with an accent, and it's an obvious accent. This is not going to change, and if people like it, then it's good. If people don't like it, then bad luck. I'm here. And this is the attitude that I have. I used to be hurt when I hear comments And in the first year of my training, sadly, a couple of my colleagues who, one of them is the same rank as I am in the Air Force. We're both reservists in the Air Force. And they were chatting to each other in front of me, bluntly saying the Australian orthopedic training standards has dropped to allow a refugee to be into the training scheme. And I looked at them and I said, what the hell? I mean, this is really stupid. What does this has to do with the training? What does this has to do with orthopedic and medicine? I mean, we go by merits. If you pass the exam, then you become a member of the orthopedic training. But historically, the orthopedic training is known to be a very white Anglo-Saxon. You have to go to the right school, right place, and till today we laugh about it. Every time we go in a conference or a meeting, the first thing they ask me is that, which school did you go to? And I say, Baghdad Grammar.
Because of course the irony there, as you will discover when you read the book, is Munjed comes from a quite patrician background, so it's, there are a lot of layers of irony contained in that story. So I think I'll open it now for some questions. We have a microphone in the middle.
I'd like to follow through on your line about the success stories. Can I give a quick plug to a fringe show called Deception, which stars a Vietnamese...
He's over there, Vin, yeah! You are amazing.
If you want to see a fun show, but a very heartwarming show, go and see Deception. It's in Gluttony. But my question is really, you've talked about the cruelty of treatment in the detention centres. I'd like to ask if you can paint a picture, and maybe you two can't, I don't know, but somebody may be able to do so, about what happens afterwards. Yesterday I was in Darwin, and I got a taxi from the city centre to the airport, a Sudanese taxi driver, and in the course of the conversation we had, I learned that he's paying $600 a week in a Housing Commission 2-bedroom unit. Now, if that isn't exploitative, I don't know what is. He earns about $100 a day on a good day. And so I'd like to know is what's being done to help the people at the other end of the scale, and if our politicians here, maybe not today, but could reassure me that we're not exploiting the refugees that are trying to assimilate into our society.
Well, the problem is now the current policy is that people who are released, they're not allowed to work, and that's a really serious problem unless you fall, correct me if I'm wrong. When I was released back then, I had a temporary protection visa which entitled me to work. But now people are coming, I receive every week at least a letter from an ex-refugee from Iraq who is a doctor and asking if they can come and do observership because their visa status does not allow them to earn living, which is kind of counterintuitive. The people, they are wanting to work, but they're not allowed to, which is, I mean, I don't know.
A friend of mine, a really good friend of mine in Sydney, works for the Red Cross, and her job is to support these people, and she welcomes them at the airport, and she helps to look for housing and so forth. And she also said the issue of, not giving you the dignity to contribute and to be a functioning member. Work is actually dignity. And so, these people, so she's trying to create volunteer programs where they can just actually do something, because it continues the dehumanization process that's already, germinated from when you are in the detention facility. And then when you're out, you're continued to be undermined, and you're not permitted to do things that normal, functioning members of society can do. And so that is what is continuing. It's an extension of the dehumanization process.
And the comment I'd make is a comparative one with the 1990s when, of course, the Balkan Wars were on, and my family was involved with helping many people who came from the former Yugoslavia to Australia. And of course, Australia was very generous in accepting people at that time, including people from mixed marriages. My background's half Serb and half Croat. which is complicated. And look, we did it. That's not very long ago. And so those people were received with so many more mandarins, actually. We were, relatively speaking, handing out bags of mandarins. And I look at the children of those families who came, and now they've all got MBAs and 3 houses and blah, blah, blah. And so it's not so long ago that we were doing it differently. And I may be naive, but I do think that what can be broken by people can be fixed by people. So this country does have a different kind of tradition to draw on.
My name is Irene Yuri Miketa, and I landed in Australia on the 25th of May 1949. On my first day in Australian school, I became Mick, and I've stayed that way. And I've been involved in working within the migrant community all my life, including working with the Ethnic Broadcasters Incorporated in Adelaide. And back in about 1981, when the Vietnamese community applied to join EBI, I had quite a battle because one of the European migrant nations were very much against it. The Vietnamese came here with their pockets laden with gold, and they had everything given to them, including language lessons and so on, which is something that we didn't get. But their attitude was to defend their territory. And my little rubber band snapped. And when it came to the vote, nobody voted against the Vietnamese community. But it seems that the pendulum has swung towards that idiotic redneck territory, and no political party is willing to stand up and say something, show some leadership. And I despair. I suppose this is more of a comment than a question.
And a very eloquent one, thank you. Would you like to respond in any way to that?
I think that actually, you know, some of the main proponents of the current anti-asylum seeker stance is actually a lot of the migrant communities. And you know, you would think that because the migrant and other refugee communities had the hospitality or the opportunity to settle here, they would be more open-minded about the new refugees. And I think that it actually goes to a belief that these new people coming are a threat to the opportunity that they actually have. And for new refugees or the newer generation, we're talking about 30 years, you know, say the Vietnamese community, when you come from trauma and you have an opportunity to actually drink clean water and to breathe the air, clean air, there is always at the back of your mind that trauma lingering in the background. And even if it's just a small hint of fear, it's a fear that, you know, this that we already have will be taken away from us at some point, and depending on the level of trauma that those people have experienced. And so I see that in certain individual people, refugees who have settled here for 20, 30 years, you know, sharing this sort of terrible anti-asylum seeker sentiment. And I say, why? It's not rational, but none of this is rational. It's emotional. It's not intellectual. And that's what I have found from those people. But I think broadly, what's propelling this is thinking that all of this is a zero-sum game. Your gain is my loss. Your opportunity, you know, means that I lose my opportunity. That's not true at all. And so we have to stop feeling threatened. If we actually are able to think in a more sophisticated, complex way, then we will be that society that will be actually more, economical. There is no doubt that there is a different, cost-efficient way of doing this. There is no doubt. But we will not be able to even explore that model if we can't change the underlying tones of threat and fear.
Would you like to add anything to that?
Well, I mean, what I think is that unfortunately Australia is heading toward a serious polarization of opinion, and this fear tactic is a strategy that's been used over and over and over again, that everybody that come as an outsider is trying to take your piece of bread. And this is very wrong, because we have huge resources, and our main resources out of all what we've got is our human factor, and ideally Australia should grow in population to become a very prosperous and very strong country. We need to be building this country to around 40 million people, and funny enough, these asylum seekers that have been portrayed as terrorists and fundamentalists, majority of them are running away from these countries because of terrorism and because of fundamentalists are trying to persecute them. So they are the ones who are the victims, and we are accusing them of being the fundamentalist, and that's so ridiculous. And the other thing is that another picture that's tainted, as these asylum seekers are all poor and they are all economic migrants. Well, let me tell you, there are 50 million people who are displaced in the Middle East at the moment, or not in the Middle East, but around the globe, that need settlement, which is the largest since the Second World War. The vast majority of them has no economic means to migrate to Europe or to Australia. The lucky ones, like myself, who had the financial means to pay smugglers, are the ones that got here. So money is not the issue. I feel sorry for the people who cannot pay the smuggler that get there. And unfortunately, the crises are happening in countries where none of these countries have signed the Geneva Convention. Jordan is the only place in the Middle East that has signed the Geneva Convention treaty, and it's doing a great job and a very honorable job. I feel very, very supportive of the Jordanian government and their king, that Jordan, as a small nation with very limited resources, with no water, has increased its population by 30% since the war started. That's a massive increment. Al-Zaatari camp, that harboring all these Syrian and Iraqi escapees, is the 6th largest city in Jordan as we speak. I mean, that's ridiculous. And they're doing much better than we are doing here in Australia, in a very rich country, which is sad.
That's a beautiful note on which to conclude. It's been a great privilege and pleasure to share the stage with two such dignified Australian voices and thoughtful voices on a really painful topic for many people. When we were in the green room, we put the two titles of the books together, and we decided that what we all are is walking free, and we are here. So it's great to be here, and I feel like we should have had a bowl of mandarins to distribute at the end, but perhaps that's for next time. And please thank our authors. And just a reminder that they will be available to sign their works at the signing table in front of the bookstore. So thank you for your attention and participation today.